This is Dr. Melanie Edwards, and you're listening to the STS Resilient Surgeon podcast, the only show dedicated to inspiring cardiothoracic surgeons to be their best selves in and out of the OR using scientifically proven strategies and tools from the world's top performers. In cardiothoracic surgery, we function in environments that demand sustained focus, rapid switching, and error-free execution, often under fatigue, interruption, and cognitive load. Today's episode is about one of the most underappreciated determinants of surgical performance, attention. We will explore what the science actually tells us about how attention works, why it fails, and how we can optimize it. To help us answer these questions, I'm joined by Daniel Smilek, PhD, professor of psychology at the University of Waterloo, and an internationally recognized expert on human attention. His research examines attentional engagement and disengagement, why our minds wander, how media multitasking degrades performance, what creates flow, and how boredom subtly erodes focus in high-demand settings. Dr. Smilek has published more than 180 peer-reviewed articles with over 2,300 citations and has co-authored multiple editions of a leading undergraduate textbook on cognition. He serves as associate editor of the British Journal of Psychology and in 2024 received the Mid-Career Award from the Canadian Society of Brains, Behavior, and Cognitive Sciences in recognition of his contributions to cognitive science. Dr. Smilek, welcome to the Resilient Surgeon.
Thank you for inviting me on the podcast, Melanie, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Dan. We're really glad you're here. And I had heard you speak at the Canadian Association of Thoracic Surgery meeting, and I remember the collective gasp as you presented. We were really blown away. So I'm thrilled that you're here to enlighten us about something that we think we understand, but I think we really do not. And I'm really interested to dive into this a little bit more. So, to get started, you gave an example of just how unaware we are of the dangers of running on autopilot and how we have no idea of the extent to which our brains can sort of zone out. Can you describe this and describe what happened in your example?
Yeah, so the example I often use is a TV news report of a paratransit bus driver who causes this massive accident. And the news report includes video footage from two cameras, one showing the inside of the bus and the other showing what's happening in front of the bus. And what you see in these videos is the driver driving his bus on a freeway, and there are not many cars around. It's pretty empty. There are no passengers on board, so he's not being distracted. He's not talking on a cell phone. He's looking directly ahead, and then suddenly he crashes into the cars in front of him on an exit ramp. And he's going full speed when this happens without even tapping the brakes. And I think what's shocking about this is that his eyes were wide open, but then he completely fails to see the cars that are in front of him. And by the way, I gather from post-investigation reports that there were no drugs involved in this. Okay, so he's not on drugs, not distracted, looking straight ahead, and he causes this massive accident. People find this surprising. Like you said, people just gasp when they see this. And I think the reason why many people find it surprising is because they believe that when their eyes are open, they're able to consciously process all the information in front of them continuously. It's like we have some sort of a high definition camera recording all the events in front of us, and this camera is in our brain. And so they think they wouldn't miss something obvious, like a car like a car that they're approaching right in front of them. But actually, what the research shows is that the brain can't process all of the information in our visual field all at once, and that we only have detailed conscious awareness of a small subset of the information in our visual field at any given moment. And this feeling that we have, that we're aware of everything that we look at, is in the literature called the grand illusion of perception. And it's a creation of our brain. Actually, perception is a reconstruction and partly a construction of external stimulation. And there's a lot of filling in that happens. And so this is part of this illusion and creation of our brain. And it turns out that contrary to that illusion, conscious awareness depends on this limited pool of resources. We refer to them as attentional resources. And if those resources are not applied to a critical object, we fail to see that object. We fail to become aware of it. And this is referred to as inattentional blindness. And very likely, I think the bus accident was the result of this inattentional blindness. It's basically a failure of attention. And because of the grand illusion of perception, we often underestimate the limits of human attention, and we underestimate the power of this inattentional blindness.
Wow, that is profound. So not only do we have limited perception, but we're blind to it. We think we can see everything. We think we're looking in 4K high def when what we're seeing isn't really real. Our brain is sort of filling in the gaps of what we think is actually there. And, it's a little scary because if we're not aware of a problem, then how do we fix it? In terms of our attentional resources and attention, what are the different types of inattention? And can you describe what is happening in the brain in those different instances?
Yeah. So there are several ways that inattention can manifest. So one of the most obvious way is attending to external distractions. And by external, I mean things outside of our mind. So these might include attending to secondary tasks or salient stimuli like flashing lights or unique colors or something. And the distractions can be visual, they could be auditory, they could be tactile, they can even involve bodily sensations. Like if you're in surgery and you're like, I gotta go to the bathroom. I'm just imagining that would be a distraction. And so that's kind of the obvious thing. Maybe the more interesting one is this other way that inattention can manifest, and that is by shifting attention internally. So to internal distractions. And we refer to this as task unrelated thoughts, mind wandering, or people colloquially refer to it as daydreaming, zoning out or tuning out. And we might think that this is not very important, but actually the research shows that it's strikingly common. Across many tasks, it occurs roughly between 20 and 50% of the time. Wow. And that's the case in laboratory scenarios, in real world scenarios, because there's been experience sampling studies that were done using smartphones. And even sometimes in relatively complex tasks, we find ourselves mind wandering quite often. And I think that's important because both external and internal distractions take limited attentional resources away from the primary task at hand. Okay, so this precisely might explain what happened to the paratransit bus driver. He likely began to mind wander because he's on this empty highway, right? Yeah. So he starts thinking about something else, which took his attention away from processing the visual information in front of him, and this ultimately made him functionally blind. So the striking thing is that internal thinking, like mind wandering, can lead to inattentional blindness. But I think most of us think it should be so benign. It shouldn't, matter if I have a thought here or a thought there. But actually, it could be very problematic.
Wow. One area that I think we may also fool ourselves is in our ability to multitask.
Right.
Most of us think that we can do multiple things at once and still be effective. And I think deep down, we probably know this not to be true. But mundane tasks like charting at night while you're, watching TV, etc., we think we can do multiple things at once. What does the science say about this?
Yeah, I think the answer there depends on the sort of tasks that are involved. So I think there are tasks that are more automatic that don't require attentional resources. And some of these can be done concurrently without any cost of performance. So the example is walking, chewing gum, for instance, right? Or, riding a bike and talking, right? Those can be done because, they're relatively automatic. And I think that's what actually lulls us into believing that we can do multiple things at once, right? Yeah. Because of these automatic tasks. And they use a particular area they use areas of the brain that can do these tasks simultaneously. They can handle it. But then there are tasks that require attention. These are more complex tasks. So things like engaging in a deep conversation. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, if you pair one of these tasks with an automatic task like walking, you generally get no cost to performance. Okay. But once you pair two attention demanding tasks together and have them performed concurrently, that's when you get performance failures, right? Or at least performance suffers in some ways. And a good example of this is a paper by Strayer and Johnson, and they study dual tasking while driving. They do a lot of research
Yeah.
on multitasking while you're driving, like talking on cell phones, for example. And they do this experimentally as well. And in one experiment, they had people do this complex math task called the O-span task while driving in the simulator. And what they find is that when people have to do these two tasks together, most of the individuals, like 97.5% of the individuals, show performance decrements of some kind. Okay.
Wow.
So even just doing like mental arithmetic and driving impairs
Yeah.
performance. But the interesting thing, I'll just throw this in there because your listeners might find this interesting, is that there were this special few people, about 2.5% of the individuals who in that experiment showed no dual task interference or dual task costs. They performed without impairment, and they named these super taskers. Okay.
Excellent.
And I think that's, we have to be very clear that's only, 2.5% of the population right now. I think for your audience, like surgeons, you guys are also this very high performing small percentage of the population. So
Yeah.
maybe some of you are super taskers,
Oh,
but the majority of the population, they're not super taskers. Generally, we should probably assume that we're not a super tasker. But I think the other thing I want to add here is that I suspect that even if they increase the difficulty of the tasks,
yes.
that in the end, everybody would fail, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So generally, multitasking with attentionally demanding tasks does increase the likelihood of making an error. And in safety critical settings, it's very dangerous.
Yeah. So we're really talking about attention as a limited resource and the fact that the more or attention is required for any given task, the less we are able to do multiple things, and the more we need to pay attention to both internal and external distractions.
Mhm.
How much does this degrade performance, these um, difficulties with attention and these
Yeah.
distractions? How bad can it get?
Yeah, so I think it really depends on the task. Many tasks, what they have are these fluctuating demands, right? So if you can schedule your mind wandering, let's say, or your distraction within the moments of the task that don't require a lot of resources, then you're going to be okay. And that's why I think many cases we can get away with some form of mind wandering and media multitasking or distraction.
Yeah,
But then when we in the inopportune situations, when the demands go up and we're not attentive at that moment, that's when we fail. And
yeah,
then basically the degree or the consequence of the error
yeah,
depends on the risk in the situation, right? James Reason was the one who really talks about this. He said, the same cognitive mechanism that leads to an error in the kitchen, let's say while you're making breakfast,
yeah.
that same mechanism is at play when a pilot makes a mistake flying an airplane. It's just
Wow.
that the risk in those two situations is different and the consequences are different. And then so the consequences are much higher for the same kind of attentional slip for the pilot than it is for, when you're making your breakfast in the kitchen. So it's all about the circumstances and the context and the risk of that task.
So this is really important for us as surgeons because for us, the risk of inattention and the risk of errors is quite high. There may be fluctuations, as you note, times in an operation, for example, when you're closing, say, all the critical parts are done, we're closing, but even then, there can be small errors made. And those errors, while they may not be quite as catastrophic, do have consequences say you're closing the chest, you get a little bit of bleeding because you weren't paying attention. Then you have to spend another 10 or so minutes
Mm.
cleaning that up. And, it's 10 minutes that, in the span of a day, almost every second matters. But it it brings up a few things for me and I'm sure some of our listeners as we design our environments. Are there ways that we should design our environments, say in the operating room, to account for attentional fluctuations?
Yeah, I think the first one is just maybe not in terms of design, but in terms of just awareness, right? Because
Yeah.
a lot of these tasks, what they have are these moments. Expert task performance is typically a combination of automatic and controlled attention demanding performance, right? And as you become more expert, more things become automatic. So,
Yeah.
maybe the process of stitching initially took you all your focus, but then it's like it's a little bit more automatic once you've done, 10,000 of them, right?
Yeah.
Or 1,000, whatever it may be. And so it's just awareness of the fact that there are these stretches where the automatic system can take over and do pretty well. And actually, in those moments, you might be at risk because you may indulge in some mind wandering or some distraction at that moment. But if something goes wrong, then all of a sudden your attention is not there to be able to stop that problem. So one of them is just awareness, and then maybe having sort of processes in place within the surgery, for one, to sort of minimize or manage distractions. One way to do that is to really train the staff, I think, on how attention operates, how attention works, so that they themselves don't become distractions. Like the other team members, maybe of the individual doing the main work, and having some procedures in place, I think, to recognize how attention operates, and then for everybody to remain vigilant, especially during those moments when people think maybe that now they're safe. Now I can
Yeah.
indulge in some
Yeah.
inattention.
You've mentioned about inattention being somewhat of a contagion. Is it just
Right.
because we all go into autopilot, or are there other mechanisms at play, and how prevalent is this?
Yeah. So there are two ways to think about this. So one way to think about attention sort of spreading among individuals, right, is just simply by the fact that there might be other people in the environment who start to become a distraction, right? So they might not be directly involved in the work. They start talking about something, and now that draws your attention, right? So
Yeah.
they become a distraction. So now that's a social way in which inattention can spread, right?
Yeah.
But there's a second way that's quite interesting, and that is that we seem to mimic other people's levels of attention. Okay,
Ah,
and we've shown this in the context of a classroom. So we had a experiment where we had Confederates in a classroom. So these were other people that were on the experimenter team,
yeah.
and they were trained for some, in some cases to appear very attentive, right? Sitting up straight,
Yeah.
looking straight ahead, making notes. And then in other cases, they were kind of slouching and leaning back in their chair, not making notes, looking somewhere else. And
Yeah.
then we had naive participants as well, kind of in the back row, so that they
Yeah.
could see these participants during the lecture. And what we found is that the attentiveness of the Confederates directly influenced the attentiveness of the participants. Okay,
Yeah.
and then so people like take a signal. They take a signal from others around them,
Yeah.
whether the situation needs attention, right, or how much attention they should deploy.
Yeah.
And so these are the multiple ways in which attention can spread throughout a team. It's a fascinating phenomenon because attention is fundamentally a social phenomenon.
Interesting. Interesting. So, I can definitely see direct applications here where we may not be able to control how everyone else thinks within the OR, but we can certainly influence how people behave by ourselves setting the tone and maybe assuring that we have a few, or first assistant, or, if we have a physician assistant, resident, making sure that these key people are setting the tone for everyone else. And we can get natural follow up as opposed to having to, because, I've been in ORs where people are yelling, everybody pay attention. And then, people snap into attention, but you can certainly model the behavior, which is also, um, A nice way to do it, maybe a nicer way, who knows?
Yeah, that
Um,
was a great application.
yeah, and I bring this in, and this may, seem a little unrelated, but you'll find debates, maybe not quite debates, but the question of music in the operating room. Some people feel very strongly about their music, others feel music is a distraction. Do we know anything about that and whether or not it's one or the other, or maybe we pick the times when it's appropriate?
hmm Yeah, we've actually done some studies on music and attention, and there are quite a few studies out there examining the effects of background music on task performance. And the unfortunate thing is that the results are mixed on
Yeah,
this, okay? And the reasons that they are mixed is still not fully known, but it has to do with various factors like the individual's level of arousal, the type of music, and also the difficulty of the task that's being performed.
yeah,
So I'm thinking of a study that was published recently, actually in 2025, by Bidelman and Feng, and we can maybe find this one and put it as a link to make sure I got it right.
yeah,
But what they show is that listening to familiar music while
yeah,
performing a task reduces mind wandering more than listening to unfamiliar music or background noise, right? So there's a case where it's not just about music; it's about music familiarity that
yeah.
seems to matter. And I know I've heard that sometimes you guys have like playlists that
Yes,
that people like,
absolutely.
right?
Yeah.
So it has to do with familiarity. And then there's another study that I kind of vaguely remember as well by Kissel and I think it was, and they showed that self-selected background music reduced mind wandering during an attention task more than experimenter selected background music. So
Wow.
again, this is music that you've chosen is
Yeah.
seems to be beneficial for attention. But if it's a music that somebody else chooses, now it might actually be a distraction. So it's about the match between the music and
Yeah.
the individual. That's what seems to matter. And if it's familiar and pleasing, then it might help you focus, maybe because it triggers the reward system. But if it's unfamiliar and unpleasant, now it might be distracting. And so, unfortunately, there's no one size fits all solution.
Yeah.
And I wonder. So, in your situations, you have the surgeon. Is it the head surgeon that picks the music if there's a playlist?
Typically, yes. And some will have their own individual playlist, or, some will pick a genre of music that's, familiar to them. And some feel very strongly that there be no music in the operating room, but it varies. But most of the time when there is, it is a surgeon who's saying, okay, Led Zeppelin, or, who knows. And then the poor young people, have to
they
deal
they,
with
they got to put up with it. Got it. Yeah,
deal
well,
with
it's actually worthwhile thinking about how the whole team is influenced by that, right?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
how the attention of the whole team, because some people might get some benefit and other people might not so much.
Excellent. Excellent. So we can pick the hierarchy based on what we have.
Yep.
I think this is, a very interesting exploration. And as we look at the link between inattention and errors, what are some of the other cognitive effects that we can experience from inattention?
Yeah. So there's some evidence that links high levels of inattention to increased levels of affective dysfunction, and by that I mean things like depression and anxiety. And there was one big landmark study by Killingsworth and Gilbert in 2010. I think it was published in Science. And they used smartphone technology to measure everyday mind wandering. The smartphone would give an alert and they would respond about what they're doing and what their level of mind wandering was, what their attention was like. And
Hmm.
what they concluded was that a wandering mind is an unhappy mind.
Wow.
And that's in fact the title of the paper. And that's because what they found was that more people mind wandered, the more they experienced negative affect. And it seems like the relation is bidirectional. So it's the case that negative affect will influence mind wandering, increase levels of inattention, but then inattention may
Yeah.
also, in the long run,
Wow.
influence create negative affect. So it can create this downward spiral that can
Hmm.
potentially even lead, we kind of suspect, to mental health issues, right?
Wow.
So it's really important to keep an eye on this link between attention and affect because, there's a strong link between our attention and our motivation affective systems because we generally tend to attend to things that we're
Yes.
motivated to engage in and things that we like, right?
Yeah.
So there's this close link. And so when our attention keeps failing,
Yeah.
which is what inattention, progressive inattention is kind of like a failure of attention to engage in the world,
Yeah.
then you see this knock-on effect or this correlated effect of increased affective dysfunction.
Now, this does bring up one question for me because this seems to be an internal milieu where you're disengaging almost from what's going on around you in terms of that mind wandering. Um, has the same or similar effect been seen with external distractions on affect, or is it just that it produces a little bit of stress because we feel like we're pulled in multiple directions?
Yeah. I'm not sure about the link with external distractions. What you do see is in the media multitasking realm. So when you engage in multitasking with concurrent media, that's where you see all sorts of negative effects. And that is a form of distraction, although there you're kind of
Yeah.
flipping between multiple tasks. But yeah, it's associated with mental health issues, poor attention, poor well-being, increased sense of boredom, like all the negative things, basically.
Oh boy.
So a big recommendation, just for one's wellness, is
Yeah.
actually to try to decrease media multitasking, especially I think because it's very often done in relaxation time with our social media, right?
Yeah.
And we just sort of chill out, and then we're like looking at different, our smartphones, our computers, TVs
Yeah.
playing in the background, all these things. Actually, those moments might not be good for us.
Interesting. Interesting. So the charting while watching TV may not necessarily be the best way to spend our evenings, and for other reasons too, including inefficiency. So it seems like it's very easy to become distracted. It's almost hard, getting our mind to stop wandering seems like trying to tame a wild horse or something. Why is it so hard to pay attention?
Right. So let's think about it this way. So we kind of think that sustaining attention on a task for a longer period of time is like the good thing to do, right? And obviously,
Yeah.
in many situations, that might be the case. But I want to think about the alternative possibility that sustaining attention on a single task or a stream of thought might not be always good, right? So imagine, use a few examples maybe. Imagine you're walking with a friend and you're
Yeah.
engaging in conversation and you're so enthralled, engaged in that conversation that you fail to notice that your sidewalk has ended and you're walking out into a busy road, right? So
Yeah.
that would not be very good. Or imagine, take an example in the natural world. You imagine there's a hunter and
Yeah.
he's so focused on his game that he doesn't notice the bear approaching from the side about to eat him.
Yeah.
Also not good, right? Or here's quite a different example. Imagine the depressed individual who can't stop thinking about a negative thought, right?
Hmm.
We call this rumination. The same thought keeps playing over and over and over again. So that's another case where you don't want to sustain on that thought.
Yeah.
And so these examples show that it's not always functional for our attention to be fixed for too long on some tasks.
Hmm.
And the brain then seems to have a built-in mechanism that periodically disengages attention from tasks
Yeah.
because in many situations this can be very functional, right? So
Yeah.
the way I think about it is that we kind of have a variability mechanism where the brain says, "Oh, let's think about something else for a moment," right? And then our
Yeah.
task is to kind of pull it. If we need to focus on a particular task, we got to
Yeah.
pull attention back to that task. So it seems the natural state of attention is one where it regularly entertains alternatives, and it's worthwhile thinking that perhaps the need to sustain attention on single tasks for a prolonged period of time is something that might have emerged in modern civilization. Okay.
Yeah.
Because if you think about it, maybe in history, when we're living more in nature, what are the tasks that require, there's no computers, there's no
Oh,
like prolonged surgery, right?
yeah.
So you're actually, and it's better in those environments for you to be shifting attention and considering alternatives.
Yeah.
And in fact, there was a French psychologist in the late 1800s, Theodore Ribot, and he published a book, I think it was in 1889, on psychology. It's a fantastic old read, classic. And he argued that we come into this world with what is called spontaneous attention, which is
Mm,
driven primarily by our basic needs.
yeah.
And that makes sense because your attention is there to select things that are going to help you survive, right?
Yeah.
And then he said, built on top of that is controlled voluntary attention, which he said is the product of training and of civilization. Okay, it's a
Wow.
civilizing force. And in fact, because of the way our work has changed, right now we sort of demand almost all the time in our work
Yeah.
just continued attention, which is not our natural state. So mind wandering, in some sense, is the default natural state, and sustained attention is
Mm,
the unique achievement, and one that is needed much more in today's civilization. Yeah.
that's interesting. Um, it's interesting how or modern society and work and all the things that we consider to be normal actually are opposite to the way our bodies are wired. This may be part of the reason that it's suggested that people take intermittent breaks, for example, during tasks. I know there are Pomodoro timers, et cetera, out there, not necessarily for use, say, in surgery, but in, while one is doing, say, if you're writing a paper example. And even for us in the operating room, we'll sometimes take what I like to think of as like an ergonomic break. You lift your head up and, do a little stretch, and maybe those could be examples of ways to sort of break your attention a little bit so that you can voluntarily refocus. I don't know if there's any value to that or what your
Yes.
thoughts are.
Yeah. In fact, there's quite a bit of research that shows that taking breaks restores attention. So what happens in a lot of situations is that as a task progresses, what you see is a progressive attentional decline, and mind wandering tends to increase, some distractions increase over
Yeah.
time. But if you take a short break, and it could be actually even very short, what you see is all of a sudden attention is replenished, mind wandering reduces. And again, that lasts for some time, but then you start to get the decline again. So, yeah, taking short breaks is been shown to be definitely important. And it seems that the question is what kind of breaks, and really anything
Yeah.
different than what you're doing seems to be
Yeah.
beneficial. So there is
Yeah.
evidence that supports that, and it could be that actually mind wandering and this natural drive for mind wandering to occur. This is speculation. Might be the
Yeah.
mind's way of taking a mini break from the
Yeah.
primary task, right? But if
Yeah.
you schedule breaks in, then that will definitely have benefits.
Yeah. Is there any data on the interval, the time interval? Should it be an hour, 90 minutes, 30 minutes?
I suspect that's very task specific. So even
Yeah.
if there was data, I would imagine, because what we see is attention decline is task specific. It
Yeah.
happens much faster in certain tasks than other tasks, right? So for instance, if I give people get them to view a very interesting video lecture, they can stay focused for quite a long time before you see a decline, a start of a
Yeah.
decline.
Yeah.
But if it's something that's really dry and, and
Yeah.
and boring, you see the decline almost right away. So
Got it.
it really depends on the task. So in some cases you want breaks,
Yeah.
after short periods. In other cases, you could probably go for quite a long time. Basically, you should figure out when attention starts to decline, and at that point, take a break. And
Yeah.
people who have, good insights into their attention,
Yeah.
they're able to figure that out and make that judgment. And
Yeah.
so, yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, just paying attention to our attention, I think, can yield a lot of benefits in terms of knowing ourselves, being aware, and understanding the context in which we're functioning. Um, If we look at these in the moment strategies, what are other strategies that you can think of for us to help maintain our attention when it is appropriate to do so?
Right. So the first one would be kind of let's get the obvious one out of the way, which is managing distractions, right?
Yeah.
And external distractions are again, kind of obvious that we have to deal with, but we can also start to manage the internal distractions. And it turns out when you study mind wandering, it turns out that there are some episodes of mind wandering that are spontaneous, right? They just happen to you, they're outside of your control. But there are also many that appear to be deliberate. So
Uh,
people actually just choose, oh, I think I can mind wander right now. And then when you probe them, you say, yeah, I kind of decided to mind wander.
hmm,
And so what this means is that there's a lot of those episodes of mind wandering that we can control and that we can actually stop.
yeah.
And I think the other way to reduce these episodes of mind wandering, these internal distractions, is by using a form of offloading of important tasks. And so there is some evidence that mind wandering is driven by our current concerns, things that are sort of left undone, these unfinished tasks. They seem to keep coming back to mind. That seems functional because you want to finish the task.
Yeah.
But they can be distractions in the inopportune if they come to mind at inopportune times. But there's some evidence that if you write down these important things that are on your mind and also include the next actionable step in what you would sort of do to address that concern, and you write it down on paper before you do a task, those things are less likely to intrude into mind wandering during the task. So it's a way to basically reduce the likelihood that your mind wandering is going to be driven by your current concerns. So there's techniques like that can be used.
That's excellent. It's almost like our brain is carrying a reservoir of unresolved ideas and unresolved worries and unresolved problems. And so once we give it the permission to let these things go, there's less that we're carrying and less that we're going to have to constantly think about, oh, I forgot to, order this, or I forgot to ask somebody to order this scan or whatnot. Write it down, get it done, send a message, and then your brain sort of is able to let it go.
Yes.
What else is there that we can do to help ourselves?
Yeah. So one of the main drivers of inattention and attention and peak attentional focus is actually intrinsic motivation.
Mm,
And so I imagine in the surgery context, this is probably not a problem. Um, Perhaps though, after a surgeon has done 1,000 of a particular type of surgery, maybe some complacency sets in. And so the key is to stay intrinsically motivated to perform maximally in the task. So outside the surgery, if we're talking about other tasks, I
yeah,
think that intrinsic motivation is one of the main drivers. And in our experiments, we see that we can really move around people's levels of attention
yeah,
by varying their levels of motivation. So that's a really big one.
yeah.
I think the other one that I would mention is emotional management. And we already talked about the link between affect and attention.
Yeah.
So what you want to do in order to perform maximally in terms of your attention is to also sort of avoid being in these negative attentional states and increase your emotional regulation. And related to that is stress. And
Mm,
what we know is that prolonged stress increases circulating stress hormones that can ultimately damage neurons in control centers of the brain, such as the prefrontal cortex. And stress can lead to inflammation. We kind of know all the physiological effects there and damage the brain. But stress can also lead to certain thoughts dominating consciousness and
mm,
distracting one's attention from a primary task at hand. And this is the idea of rumination, right? So if you're stressed out about something, it effectively, linking to this to the earlier point, it becomes a current concern then that seems to grab our attentional resources. So emotional management would be the other one
yeah.
that's very closely related. And I think there are three general recommendations I would make with
Yeah.
regard to overall health factors. And I think actually these are the most important ones. Okay. And so there are three things that have been shown really regarding lifestyle and health factors that seem to influence attention. And one of them is sleep. Okay. So maybe obvious, but poor sleep and sleepiness are linked to increase in attention. So good night's sleep is important. Now, when you're sleepy, you can exert effort to counteract the sleepiness, but you can only do that for so long. And then you'll start to see attentional problems emerging. So sleep is one. The other one is diet. Okay. And we know now that there's lots of work showing a link between the gut and the brain, the gut-brain axis, whereby the overall health of the gut seems to influence the health of the brain. And so if there's dysbiosis in the gut and there's inflammation, that inflammation tends to make its way to the brain. It can actually influence the control centers in the brain, such as the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is a very important control center for attention. And then you may get experiences like brain fog, right? Wow. And so your diet actually, and there are lots of individual differences with diet, so I don't have any particular dietary recommendations, but we know that actually fasting to some degree seems to kick in these cleanup mechanisms that increase brain-derived neurotrophin factor, which is a growth factor that helps neurons become more healthy. Wow. So, fasting and then obviously staying away from the junk food diet. That's where the results are really strong. The highly processed junk food diet seems to be linked to these the poor attention performance. And then the third one is exercise. And the results there are pretty straightforward. If you're living a sedentary lifestyle, you're much more likely to experience inattention. And the reason is kind of obvious because exercise, for one, what it does is it increases cardiovascular health. And that's very important for overall brain health because the cardiovascular system is what's delivering the resources to the brain. But secondly, what we see is that with exercise, you get an increase in nerve growth factor. And you actually see nerves expressing nerve growth factor and becoming more healthy as a result. And that's especially the case in older individuals. There's data that, moderate exercise improves cognition across multiple domains in older individuals. And so these three things together, sleep, diet, exercise, if you can really focus on developing good habits within these domains, just overall, your just well-being will be better, but your attention will be substantially better as well.
Excellent. I think those are both encouraging in their simplicity in that it doesn't really require us to do anything extraordinary, and that we each have control both internally and externally, where sometimes we feel like there are all these external things coming at us. But if we implement these factors, number one, managing our distractions, number two, setting or understanding or attentional limits and setting ourselves up by taking breaks as needed, be aware of our brain's propensity to mind wander, and also set ourselves up with our core of diet, exercise, and sleep, as you mentioned. And just really quickly before we close, any influence on mindfulness in terms of attention? Is there any data that being more mindful can help us focus a bit?
Yeah, so there are various training protocols that people have tried because the idea is that, hey, maybe we can train attention somehow. And so people started with these brain training games. You do some tasks on the computer or Sudoku puzzles or something, and then you're supposed to improve your attentional performance. That work hasn't really panned out. So attention training using these games, there's one task, the useful field of view task, that does seem to have a little bit of an effect. And so that one might be studied some more, but generally they don't work very well. But what does seem to work, and there's lots of evidence now, is attention state training, which essentially is the core part of mindfulness practice. And so basically it involves relaxing yourself and then choosing a single point of focus. And very often, because you're relaxing and you're breathing, people maybe choose to focus on their breath.
Yeah.
It could be something else, like a point in space or a particular thought, or a sensation. And then as you're trying to focus on that single point of focus, when your mind wanders, you notice it, and then you gently redirect your attention back to that simple point of focus. And you don't get stressed out about the fact that your mind has just wandered.
Yeah.
You bring attention back, you forgive yourself, and then you continue the exercise. And there is evidence that if you do this regularly and you practice this, you do seem to improve attention, reduce mind wandering, and maybe improve other aspects of well-being. So those are the core components of, I think, a lot of mindfulness training programs. Now, people add certain things in there, but some of that you can actually do even in the context of surgery. So like, let's imagine before you start surgery, you could try imagining just going through, okay, I'm going to start the surgery, and imagine the process and see when your mind wanders from this process of imagining. And then you bring it back on task and then continue the process of imagining. It's like visualizing over time how this thing unfolds. And then that could be your primary focus, right?
Yeah.
And then you're monitoring your attention. And if you mind wandering, you bring it back on task. So you can even do it in these work-related kind of ways. In addition, I think to mindfulness, one of the things you mentioned is being aware of your own attention. I think one of the things mindfulness might do is give you some of that awareness, because you're kind of focusing on your attention and you're focusing on your mind wandering, right? But I think in general, it's a good idea for people to become more, I'm going to say more attentive, but to notice more when their mind wanders or what distracts them in various contexts, right? So when you're in surgery next time, just take a quick note of when you are distracted, right? Because that builds your understanding and your knowledge of what's driving your attention. And that knowledge is power. We actually call that knowledge metacognitive knowledge. And in the context of attention, we call it meta-attention. Now you can use that knowledge to control your attention in future situations. And so building up that knowledge, I think, is very useful. And you can do that during a mindfulness training exercise, but you can also do that just as you engage in your task in everyday life. And I think those become very powerful tools then that help you control your attention going forward.
Well, this is excellent. I think that we've certainly gotten a lot of both the understanding of what drives our attention or awareness, and as well as practical tools to be able to better focus and frankly live better, because as you noted, a lot of these habits do translate into healthier bodies and healthier brains overall. Dr. Smilek, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to be here today. I think, as you mentioned, that having the awareness of how much we need to guard our attention, curiosity, and then really just implementing some simple practices can certainly be half the battle to gaining better focus and hopefully better outcomes for our patients. To our listeners, thank you for taking this time and spending this time with us today. Check out the show notes for links to additional information about attention on our podcast webpage at sts.org/podcasts. Share this episode with your colleagues and know that we want to hear from you. Post a comment or offer a topic for an upcoming show. The contents of this show do not necessarily represent the opinion and policy of STS and should not be considered an endorsement by the organization.